Welcome to the Daily News Currents. Today is Monday, April 7th, and for today's headlines we have: How much will tariffs raise prices? Trump economists just revealed their answer. Mass protests across the country show resistance to Trump. The ex-convict who turned down Columbia's PhD offer. Recovering Pope surprises pilgrims with a public appearance. An endangered Galapagos tortoise is a first-time mother at 100. How much will tariffs raise prices? Trump's economists just revealed their answer. When Trump announced his latest tariffs on Wednesday, he also ignited an economic mystery. Just where in the world do these numbers come from? Holding up a sign on the White House lawn, Trump pointed to a new 34% tax on imports from China. For the EU, a tax of 20%. Vietnam got 46%, India 26%, Nigeria just 15%. Trump claimed that these reciprocal tariffs reflect how other countries already tax American products. That means they do it to us and we do it to them, he said. Very simple. That is not true. These are not reciprocal tariffs. They do not correspond to the tariff rates in other countries. The truth behind where these tariffs came from is far more interesting. On Wednesday night, the administration revealed how they calculated the new tariffs, which are the highest taxes on foreign products that America has seen in generations. For sons of that era, listen to Planet Money episode on Smooth Howley tariffs. Buried in that math, finally, is a straightforward answer to a question that Trump has long refused to straightforwardly answer. How much will his tariffs raise prices? Diving deep into Trump's tariff math. This is the Trump administration's tariff formula, as revealed on Wednesday night by the Office of U.S. Trade Representative. Behind these Greek letters, there's a blunt but understandable approach. Essentially, the equation is trying to understand the question: how high should we set tariffs in order to get Americans to buy fewer foreign products and close the trade deficit? The math says the more of a trade deficit the U.S. has with another country, the higher that trades should be on that country's products. Take China, for instance. Last year, Americans imported about $439 billion worth of products from China, chiefly electronics, clothing, and machinery, while exporting only $144 billion. According to this formula, a 67% tax on those Chinese products should correct this trade imbalance. On Wednesday, Trump announced that the actual tariff would only be half of that, or 34%. Here's how Trump's math says it would work. The 67% tax should raise the prices of Chinese products in the United States, and those higher prices should discourage Americans from buying Chinese products or products that contain Chinese companies. This is contrary to Trump's previous public statements, where he has variously denied that tariffs would raise our prices, or has said that he couldn't care less. But according to Trump's math, the tariffs are supposed to raise prices, because those higher prices are the driving force that will close the trade deficit. There are a couple of major assumptions in Trump's math. The biggest assumption involves how much the tariffs would cause prices to go up. Here, the administration makes an eyebrow-raising admission. It guesses that for every 10% hike in tariffs, there will be a 2.5% increase in prices. Translations: Trump economists think that about a quarter of his tariffs will be passed on to American consumers in the form of higher prices. Going back to China's example, here's how it would all play out. According to Trump's math, the 67% tariff on Chinese products would cause prices of those products to go up by 16.75%. By coincidence, the administration also assumes that for every 10% increase in the price of foreign products, there will be a 40% decrease in how much Americans buy. This is on the higher but still reasonable end of what mainstream economists believe. So, faced with the 16.75% higher prices, Trump expects Americans to decrease their purchases by 4 times that amount, which brings us back to 67%. In other words, a 67% tariff on Chinese products would reduce demand for Chinese products by also 67%. So if Americans are currently buying $439 billion worth of Chinese products each year, Trump's economists expect that with the new tariff, it will reduce the spending by $294 billion, which will close the trade deficit, at least in theory. What's wrong with Trump's math? Certainly, these new tariffs are not reciprocal tariffs, but the math behind them is not wholly invented or nonsensical, despite what some online have claimed. In fact, for possibly the first time ever, the administration is explicitly acknowledging some of the basic economic logic of tariffs. Tariffs do raise prices, and higher prices do cause people to buy less stuff. And if Americans buy less foreign stuff, then America's trade deficit with other countries will narrow. But that's not to say that any of Trump's tariffs calculations arrive at the right answer. For one, these are very rough, back-of-the-envelope calculations. As laid out, the formula treats every trading partner, every good, and every industry the same. Bananas, oil, clothing, computers, or cars. It doesn't matter what a country sends to the U.S. More importantly, the formula hinges on a big assumption about how much tariffs will raise prices. Trump's math assumes that only a quarter of the tariffs will be passed on to American consumers in the form of higher prices, but economists who have studied Trump's tariffs in 2018 on steel and aluminum and various products from China calculate that almost all of those tariffs ended up being passed on to Americans. Aside from that, Trump's tariff math also ignores the broader economic consequence of these sweeping tariffs. They will have an effect on the overall American economy. They will influence exchange rates, and they will likely provoke retaliatory tariffs from other countries. So will Trump's new tariff actually close the trade deficit? Maybe, maybe not. But finally, at least, the administration has shown its work. And according to their calculations, raising prices and closing the trade deficit is what these tariffs are designed to do. Mass protests across the country show resistance to Trump. Demonstrators packed the streets in cities and towns to rail against government cutbacks, financial turmoil, and what they viewed as attacks on democracy. They came out in defense of national parks and small businesses, public education and healthcare for veterans, abortion rights and fair elections. They marched against tariffs and oligarchs, dark money and fascism, the deportation of illegal immigrants, and the Department of Government Efficiency. Demonstrators have no shortage of causes as they gathered in towns and cities across the country on Saturday to protest President Trump's agenda. Rallies were planned in all 50 states, and images posted on social media showed dense crowds in places as diverse as St. Augustine, Florida, Salt Lake City, and rainy Frankfort, Kentucky. Pouring rain, 43 degrees, biting wind, and people are still here in Albany in the thousands, said Ron Martz, a comic book writer who posted a photo of the crowd in the New York State Capitol on X. While crowd sizes are difficult to estimate, organizers say that more than 600,000 people had signed up to participate, and that events took place in U.S. territories and a dozen locations across the globe. On Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, the protest stretched for nearly 20 blocks. In Chicago, thousands flooded Daley Plaza and adjacent streets, while in the nation's capital, tens of thousands surrounded the Washington Monument. In Atlanta, the police estimated the crowd marching to the gold-domed State House at over 220,000. Mr. Trump, who was playing golf in Florida on Saturday, appeared to be largely ignoring the protest. The White House did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Some of the demonstrators waved American flags, occasionally turned upside down to signal distress. Many, especially federal workers and college students, did not want to speak on the record for fear of retaliation. Right-wing slogans like Stop the Steal were co-opted in defense of Social Security, Medicare, and cancer research. I'm tariffed. Are you? One placard read. Global financial markets tumbled this week at Mr. Trump's announcement of tariff increases, which many economists warned would raise prices for U.S. consumers. Republicans in Congress wrestled over budget proposals that included cuts to Medicaid and SNAP food benefits. Rob Alkirich, a Baltimore resident who attended the protest in Washington with his two sons and his wife, Catherine Sterner, put out a sign with a graph depicting stock market indexes plummeting that read, "Did you vote for this?" In Chicago, Marilyn Finner, 65, who works in customer service, said she had never attended a protest, but that she felt compelled to take part on Saturday because she was concerned about threats to retirement benefits. Eventually, I want to receive my Social Security that I paid for, she said. I've been working since I was 13 years old. I'm fighting for my Social Security and everybody else's. The mass action with the deliberate open-ended name Hands Off was planned at a time when many Democrats have bemoaned what they see as a lack of strong resistance to Mr. Trump. The president has moved aggressively to punish people and institutions that he views out of step with his ideology. Don Westoff, a 59-year-old accountant, was another first-time protester. He voiced outrage at the administration but had words for Democrats as well, saying they needed an infusion of younger leaders to oppose the president. "We want to let the elected Democratic officials know that good is no longer good enough," he said. "They need to fight." Multiple concerns prompted Katrine Hutchinson to drive 6 hours from her home in Tolland, Connecticut, to Washington to attend. She held up signs with names of legal residents with foreign passports whom the Trump administration has moved to deport for allegations of anti-Semitic speech and gang activities. Her 18-year-old son is transgender, she said, and she fears for his losing access to gender transition care. "Now suddenly he's a hate object, just because that's politically convenient," she said. "I'm just furious." The rallies were organized by Indivisible, Move On, and several other groups that led protests about abortion rights, gun violence, and racial justice during the first Trump administration. Organizers said they hoped to shift the emphasis to pocketbook issues like healthcare and Social Security, with the message that Mr. Trump is making life harder for the average American while benefiting his richest allies. They also moved away from focusing on mass demonstrations, like the 2017 Women's March on Washington, to instead plan hundreds of local gatherings in communities large and small. Concerns varied by location. In Ketchum, Idaho, population 3,555, cuts to the Forest Service generated deep concern, and Fiona Smith, 56, a resident who attended a protest that said she drew more than 500 people. One sign showed Smokey the Bear and read, "Only you can prevent forest fires. Seriously, we've been defunded. It's just you now." Some demonstrators had specific issues, while others opposed the Trump administration and MAGA movement in general. "Hands off my money, rights, democracy," one sign proclaimed. Make lying wrong again," and another. Elon Musk, the billionaire heading Mr. Trump's slash-and-burn attack on the federal bureaucracy, was a popular target. "I feel like the MAGA people have corrupted and co-opted the American flag and the idea of patriotism," said Barbara Santorelli, 77, a retired healthcare worker draped in a flag who participated in the New York City rally. She described herself as a Jewish centrist who was concerned about her retirement benefits, attacks on universities, freedom of speech, the war in Gaza, and due process rights. Before the event, she recounted, her daughter expressed concern for her safety. But she said attending the protest was something she had to do. "The soldiers, they go to war to defend democracy," she recalled saying. "At my age, this is how I go to war to defend democracy." In Chicago, Glenn Tipton, a 45-year-old pharmaceutical professional, said he was attending to make friends feel safer. "I'm a generic white guy, so they aren't coming for me," he said. "There's a lot of my friends who are Jewish, trans, in the military, or sick, and they're not doing okay. It's okay for me to stand out here, so I should for the ones who are afraid." Many protesters said they had been directly affected by cuts to federal jobs and grants. In Atlanta, Johnny Johnson, 34, said he had been hired by the International Revenue Service, moved, fired, and rehired in a matter of months. "I dipped into my 401k because I didn't know what was going to happen," he said. In Denver, veteran Trump protesters said there was a noticeably smaller Latino presence on Saturday than there had been at demonstrations during the first Trump term. "You notice there's not a lot of Chicano people out here. It's because people are scared," said Brian Loma, 49, an environmental organizer who set up a tent in the snow selling hot chocolate. "The government seemed to be ripping up green cards," he said. "It's crazy." Among the demonstrators in New York was Melissa Jackson, 41, a former special education teacher and a mother of 3-year-olds on a specialized learning plan for students with disabilities. "I think it's ridiculous. New York, the United States, is a melting pot. Like, what do we want? Like, not diversity, not inclusion?" she said, adding that she was also concerned about cuts to public education. "We've come too far to take so many steps back." The ex-convict who turned down Columbia's PhD offer. After 30 years in prison, Abram Rivera was headed to the Ivy League. Then he realized that because of Trump's administration threats, the university could not guarantee his funding would survive. Late in February, Abraham Rivera opened his email to receive the happy news that at 54, he had been accepted to the doctoral program in social work at Columbia University. The letter notifying him of his admission made a point of his outstanding academic record, professional achievements and excellent potential for independent scholarship with high impact. He was offered, in addition to full compensation for tuition, roughly $44,000 a year in stipends on top of whatever fellowships he might receive. His accomplishments, though, could not insulate him from the blistering politics of the moment. When he was 20 or 25, Mr. Rivera would have trouble imagining the future in the academy. He grew up in the South Bronx with public housing, where going to prison was looked at as a rite of passage, he said recently. At a certain point, he dropped out of high school, moved to Florida, in part to escape the temptations of selling drugs, but eventually he was drawn back into the trade. Still a teenager, he killed a man in a drug deal gone wrong. He was convicted of murder, and at 19, he was sent to prison for the next 30 years. He left behind a 6-month-old son, whom he only saw sporadically over the years. That fractured bond informed his academic interest. I was born at Columbia Presbyterian, he told me a few days before he was scheduled to speak on a panel about prison education. The conference, held earlier this week, took place at Penn State, where over the course of serving his sentence, he completed a bachelor's degree through a distance learning program that required him to submit his work, banged out on a typewriter, through the mail. I grew up in the shadow of these two great New York institutions, Columbia and NYU, which don't really seem as though they are for New Yorkers, he said. 5 years ago, he was released from prison. He went to CUNY for a master's degree in social work. Then he applied for doctoral programs. When I got accepted to Columbia, I was ecstatic. A few weeks after he was admitted, Mr. Rivera met with the administrator of Columbia's social work program on Zoom. She looked tearful, he told me. Given all the turmoil at Columbia, she could not say any certainty that there would be a place for him in September. Mr. Rivera was going to Columbia to study the impact of incarceration on families. While he was in prison, his son struggled, landing in the shelter system where he was introduced to drugs and developed an addiction. Mr. Rivera's work was to be financed through a grant administered by the National Institutes of Health, known as T32. But that grant was part of the $400 million the federal government threatened to pull from Columbia if it did not take a more forceful position against perceived anti-Semitism. It was now jeopardized. Even if the university acceded to the government's demands, which it soon did to so much controversy, it was still quite possible that the T32 money would not materialize. This sequence of events represented the second time that changes on federal policy directly affected Mr. Rivera's education. The Omnibus Crime Bill of 1994, sponsored by Joe Biden and signed into law by Bill Clinton, eliminated Pell Grants for prisoners. They were reinstated a few years ago, long after Mr. Rivera finished his degree, which he paid for with the help of his parents. At $130 a credit, it took him 10 years to finish. A few days after his conversation with the Columbia administrator, he sent her a note thanking her for her honesty. He told her that even though it broke his heart to step away from Columbia, he would enroll at Rutgers, State University of New Jersey, which has an endowment 1/7 of the size of Columbia's, and nonetheless still has more reliable funding stream. The precarity at Columbia troubled him, and so too did the fact that the university's response to the government has been, in his view, capitulating. He worried that at Columbia he would be more vulnerable to be targeted over his background, his political advocacy, his campaign for various criminal justice reforms in Albany, and the fact that he was Muslim. Like Columbia, Rutgers appears on a list of 60 colleges and universities that the Department of Education has cited for punishment should they fail to enforce the protections that the government has insisted on for Jewish students. But Rutgers has taken a more resistant posture. A week ago, the University Senate proposed creating a mutual defense compact, a shared financial and legal agreement among 18 universities with the purpose of standing up to the Trump administration's attacks on higher education. Earlier, the university's faculty union filed a lawsuit in federal court to try to stop federal immigration officials from detaining or deporting foreign students and teachers over pro-Palestinian advocacy. Since the 1990s, the endowments of universities like Columbia have tripled and quartered as they have more or less been served the same number of undergraduate students while admitting an ever tinier percentage of applicants. Last year, Columbia College accepted fewer than 4%. Barnard, its affiliate undergraduate women's college, accepted 9%. The paradox of a populist attack on elite universities is that it will almost inevitably make them more rarefied, less welcoming of non-traditional students like Mr. Rivera. In turn, these institutions may find themselves at a competitive disadvantage in the search for talent, especially if the compromises they forged to ward off the desecrations of the Trump administration cause potential applicants to reconsider. At Rutgers, Mr. Rivera will join a cohort of 6 doctoral students who were selected from a pool of 75 applicants. He just continually rose to the top of the interview process, Cassandra Simmel, the director of Rutgers' PhD program in social work, told me. People were really excited about him. Recovering Pope Francis surprises pilgrims with a public appearance. Pope Francis was wheeled through a crowd that included health care workers from around the world who had been told he was watching their Jubilee Mass on television. As entrances go, this one was both unexpected and welcome. That much was clear from the thunderous applause and cheers at Sunday as Pope Francis made his first public appearance since leaving the Rome hospital 2 weeks ago. Francis arrived unannounced on the dais of St. Peter's Square near the end of a mass that was part of the pilgrimage by healthcare workers and their patients. The Pope said very few words, his voice still strained after a 6-week hospital stay for pneumonia and other problems that his doctors said twice brought him close to death. "Happy Sunday to everyone, many thanks," Francis said, waving his hands. A nasal canal was visible in both nostrils. Francis continues to rely on supplemental oxygen, the Vatican has said. Sitting on the wheelchair, pushed by his trusted nurse, Massimiliano Strapatelli, Francis moved through groups of pilgrims, including dozens of doctors and nurses from around the world, who had come to the Vatican on Sunday for this weekend's Jubilee of the sick and healthcare workers. What a wonderful surprise! The Pope still has health problems, but he wanted to give a gift to the faithful, said Lamberto Rosa, a businessman who volunteers at the Order of Malta at some Vatican events. He has a fighting spirit and wants to be present. Francis has made physical closeness to his flock, dramatic gestures in a freewheeling style that hallmarks of his pontificate, and his appearance on Sunday suggested that he was determined to carry on that approach despite his physical limitations. Since leaving the hospital in March, he has been living in his suite on the second floor of the Vatican guest house he calls home. The Vatican press office has repeatedly said that Francis has not been receiving visitors as he convalesces, though it reported on Friday that his speech was improving. "It must have cost him a lot to go through that," said Giuseppe Vancor, the president of Italy's National Association for Kidney Transplant Patients, who was present in the square on Sunday. Mr. Vancor said he had been moved by the homily the Pope had written for the Mass, which was read by Cardinal Rino Fisichella. Before beginning, Cardinal Fisichella had told those present that Francis, like many ill people, was watching the Mass on television. In the homily, Francis wrote that he had much in common with you at this time of life, dear brothers and sisters who are sick, the experience of illness, of weakness, of having to depend on others in so many things and of needing their support. That is not always easy, he wrote. In his traditional Sunday blessing, made public after the Mass, Francis wrote that he prayed for doctors, nurses, and health workers, who often worked in difficult conditions. Their mission is not easy and must be supported and respected, he said, adding that he hoped necessary resources will be invested in treatment and research so that health systems are inclusive and attentive to the most fragile and the poorest. After the Mass, the Vatican issued a statement saying that Francis had prayed and participated in the ritual of passing through the Holy Door in St. Peter's Basilica like other pilgrims. On Friday, in its twice-weekly briefing on Francis's health, the Vatican said the Pope was dedicating a lot of time to monitor and respiratory therapy, showing improvements in both. It added that the flows of supplemental oxygen he required were becoming less intense, and that blood tests showed that the infections in his lungs were also improving. People applauded and cheered as Francis moved through the crowd on Sunday. Some pumped their fists in encouragement, others waved flags. Long live the Pope, they cheered. It was a grand gesture. He showed his suffering, said Massimiliano Porretta, a nurse from San Camillo Hospital in Rome. He described their appearance as an act of love towards health workers, something we try to transmit to the patients we care for. An endangered Galapagos tortoise is the first-time mother at 100. Mommy, a western Santa Cruz tortoise, recently welcomed 4 hatchlings at the Philadelphia Zoo, where she has lived since 1932. Congratulations are in order for Mommy, a Galapagos tortoise and a longtime resident of the Philadelphia Zoo, who recently became a first-time mother at the estimated age of 100. Mommy, who has now lived in the zoo since 1932, laid 16 eggs in November. 4 of them have since hatched, the first successful hatchling for her species at a zoo, which opened in 1874. She had help, of course, from Abrizo, a male tortoise who is also estimated to be about a century old. Mommy and Abrizo, both members of the western Santa Cruz subspecies, are the oldest animals of the Philadelphia Zoo, but Galapagos tortoises can live as long as 200 years old, the zoo said, putting them squarely in middle age. The first hatchling emerged on February 27th, the zoo announced on Thursday. The others followed within days, with the last one hatching on March 6th. The hatchlings, none of which had been named, are expected to be on view to the public starting April 23rd, the zoo said. They're doing fantastic, according to Zoo's director of herpetology, Lauren Augustine. Herpetology refers to the study of reptiles and amphibians. They're about the size of a tennis ball, and they're pretty feisty, actually, Miss Augustine said. The arrival of the hatchlings is significant because western Santa Cruz Galapagos tortoises are considered critically endangered by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Before the new arrivals, there was only 44 western Santa Cruz giant tortoises in all the zoos in the United States, according to the Philadelphia Zoo. The baby tortoises will likely never share the same physical space as their parents. Their imposing size, a Brizo is 410 pounds and Mommy's about 280 pounds, poses a risk that the hatchlings could be crushed. Unlike his mate, Abrizo is not a first-time parent. In 2011, he was part of a successful pairing that led to an unexpected discovery of 5 hatchlings at his previous home, the Riverbank Zoo and Garden in Columbia, South Carolina. Abrazo came to the Philadelphia Zoo on the recommendation of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which identified him as a potential genetic match for Mommy. Abrazo and Mommy were introduced in 2022, and Mommy began laying eggs in 2023. She's now laid 4 rounds of eggs. The first 3 rounds were not viable. The 4th, however, was. When she laid eggs, members of the zoo staff weighed and measured them and set them up to be artificially incubated at 2 different temperatures, one known to produce female offspring and a lower temperature known to produce males. The 4 hatchlings born this year were all female, but Miss Augustine said that 3 additional eggs were still being incubated. As sort of a testimony through the excellent care that she must be receiving at the institution, Stephen Divers, a professor of zoological medicine at the University of Georgia, said of Mommy, "It's not easy keeping a giant tropical tortoise appropriately in the northern hemisphere. The hatchlings will be kept in captivity for at least 5 years. After that, the zoo will determine what to do with them, in consultation with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. They could end up at another zoo if they are a genetic match for other tortoises, or they could live out their days in the wild in the Galapagos Islands, off the coast of Ecuador. But that would carry a risk," said Rachel Metz, the Philadelphia Zoo's vice president for animal well-being. They're at extreme risk from natural disasters, disease potentially, climate change, and invasive species, she said. Centuries ago, the Galapagos tortoise population numbered in the hundreds of thousands, but it declined over time as they were hunted for human consumption. In the last half-century, however, the population has rebounded to about 17,000 because of conservation and breeding programs. Population estimates for the western Santa Cruz tortoise vary widely, but Stephen Blake, an assistant professor of biology at St. Louis University, who's worked extensively with Galapagos tortoises, said it's likely in the thousands. The population appears to be stable and growing, he said. Because the population is small and reproduction in captivity is so uncommon, the hatchlings will receive researchers a rare case to study the tortoises from a young age in captivity, said Juan Manuel Vasquez, a biologist who has studied aging in long-living animals, including Galapagos tortoises. "Every additional tortoise counts," he said. Dr. Blake said it wasn't uncommon for Galapagos tortoises to reproduce at 100 in the wild. Given that, the hatchlings at the Philadelphia Zoo are not likely to have significant effects on conservation efforts, but they could help raise awareness about giant tortoises generally. This one reproducing tortoise, in my opinion, isn't going to do much for what's going on in the wild in direct terms, he said. But, in indirect terms, if the zoo can promote a wonder of a 100-year-old reptile producing babies for the first time, and use that as a vehicle to promote wonder among people and a conservation ethic, then so much the better. That is all for today. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye!